The alien commander held his crystal goblet high, laughing in 5 languages as Earth's tattered flags burned behind him. But that laughter died the moment the walls shook, the lights flickered, and the security feed showed a silhouette standing in the smoke, unarmed, calm, and smiling. The Turvik coalition had every reason to celebrate. Earth had fallen. Its armies shattered, governments toppled, bunkers melted to slag. Turvik soldiers marched through once proud cities like they were zoos filled with broken cages. Human resistance was scattered, hunted, and tagged. In orbit, the flagship Vornex hovered like a metallic god, projecting peace holograms in every known dialect. The war is over. Turvik has restored order. Earth is liberated. But on the surface, the streets smelled of ash, oil, and fear. Banquets were held in reclaimed skyscrapers, where alien elites boasted of conquest and mocked the savagery of Earth's species. They clinked glasses filled with exotic liquors brewed from crushed Terran fruits. One even wore a jacket sewn from a shredded UN flag, calling it vintage. Every camera recorded their celebration for broadcasts across the galaxy, a grand display of dominion over another primitive world. But in the background of one wide shot, unnoticed by everyone, a shape passed through the firelight. Brief. Too quick to track. A blur in the smoke. Commander Vrelk, decorated with 7 conquest medals and 2 planetary extermination honors, presided over the festivities with gleaming armor and practiced arrogance. "We have ended war," he declared, "by ending Earth's ability to resist." Thunderous applause followed. Champagne fizzed. Medals were handed out. A statue of a Turvik soldier crushing a Terran helmet was unveiled beneath glowing spotlights. And above them all, high in the orbiting control ship, the data monitors began glitching. The junior technician, a spindly blue-skinned analyst named Resh, frowned at his console. Patrol beacon 491b had just gone dark. Then another. And another. 10 patrols in Sector Delta 9, gone without alerts, transmissions, or traces. Resh tapped through logs. No anomalies. No weapons fire. Just flatline. He flagged the pattern to Command Central. An older officer glanced once and dismissed it. Malfunction. The humans rigged junk tech everywhere. These things happen. Reboot the grid. Resh hesitated, then obeyed. But the sense of something wrong didn't fade. It sharpened. Back on Earth, in the shadow of a destroyed observatory, a single signal pulsed to life on a forgotten relay tower. It wasn't military, encrypted, or even dangerous on the surface. Just a message. A repeating phrase in an old Terran language. No headers. No signature. Only the words. He remembers. Commander Vrelk was too busy being honored to care. Alien dignitaries offered tributes, Earth artifacts, ancient books, strange human tools. One presented him with a rusted dog tag. The commander chuckled as he read the faded name. They gave names to their meat units. He scoffed. How quaint. He tossed the tag to the floor. It landed with a metallic ping. Miles away, in a city quadrant deemed cleared of hostiles, 3 Turvik soldiers were reviewing surveillance data. One of them noticed a figure walking casually through a no-entry zone. No signature. No heat. No HUD marker. He adjusted the lens. The man was barefoot, wearing scraps of ruined tactical gear, and carried no weapon. But what stopped them cold was that he was staring directly at the camera, miles away, and smiling. The screen went black. The officer laughed nervously. We should send a drone. Probably a human scavenger. A drone was dispatched. It never came back. Instead, the camera feed returned, replaying their own conversation from moments ago, but the voices were warped and reversed, playing backwards like a ghost taunt. Then came static, and one final image, the drone's camera lying on the ground cracked, and a message etched beside it. You're not alone on this rock. In the orbital control deck, Resh finally bypassed the civilian override and pulled a deep protocol scan from Earth's subsurface frequencies. What he found made his 4 hearts skip. A file. Human origin. Coded with a classification he'd never seen, blackout, Human asset class 0. No name. No ID. Just a redacted record and an old Earth emblem, one even the Turvik historians hadn't decrypted. He pinged the central AI with a simple query: "What is blackout class 0? The AI hesitated. Then returned a single word: appeared. Commander Vrelk was summoned. He rolled his eyes at the interruption until the technician showed him the timestamp and footage. Dozens of patrol units, systems failing in synchronization, followed by the reappearance of weapons caches the Turvik had supposedly dismantled. The data showed that these failures weren't malfunctions. They were hijackings. "Impossible," Vrelk said. "No human has access. They have no network left. Their intelligence systems were destroyed." Resh didn't argue. He just turned the screen toward the commander and hit play. The scene showed the banquet hall, this very room, 2 hours in the future. The camera feed was recording before the event even began. In the footage, Vrelk was slumped against the table, blood dripping from his chin. Every Turvik officer in the room was dead. The camera flickered. And in the center, one man stood. Face in shadow. His voice played as the room went silent. "You celebrated too soon." Silence fell. Real, heavy silence. Vrelk stared at his own future corpse, then barked at his officers. "Shut it down! Wipe that footage! Lock the palace!" Too late. The banquet doors blew open, not with a bomb, but with wind. Cold wind. Smoke curled in. Lights flickered. Officers drew sidearms. Vrelk shouted orders. But none of it mattered. Because standing in the archway, barefoot, covered in ash, with a smile that didn't belong in any database, was him. No name. No insignia. Just one man who shouldn't exist. The soldiers aimed. The figure didn't move. Then, as the lights came fully on, the room gasped. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was the weapon. He looked at the commander and said, almost politely, "You forgot to check the dirt." And the lights went out. The security doors slammed shut behind the figure as emergency shutters locked across the banquet hall. The alien officers, once drunk on power and liquor, now fumbled for weapons they weren't trained to use in real combat. The air turned still, like the world itself was holding its breath. In the sudden silence, the man walked forward. No fanfare. No announcement. Just a steady, deliberate pace that echoed louder than the alarms. A Turvik lieutenant fired first. A bolt of plasma streaked toward the man's chest, and vanished. It didn't explode. It didn't hit. It simply blinked out, intercepted midair by something unseen, something the sensors couldn't register. The shooter tried again, his hand trembling now, and again the bolt disappeared. He screamed and dropped his weapon, stepping backward into a table, knocking over a glass of Terran wine that spilled like blood across the white cloth. The man spoke. His voice was calm, too calm for a battlefield. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. Just a single question, delivered like a judgment. "Which one of you ordered the orbital strike on Outpost 17? The aliens exchanged glances, uncertain who was being addressed. One of the younger officers, trying to be brave, stepped forward and sneered. "You think one human can threaten the Turvik coalition? Your species lost. Your history." The man stared at him for a moment, then stepped closer. The officer's courage crumbled. His weapon fell from his hand before he even noticed. He reached for a comm on his chest, only to find it gone. The man held it in his hand, offered it back to him, and then crushed it without a sound. The officer collapsed. He hadn't been touched. Up on the command ship orbiting above, panic bloomed across the screens. The feed from the banquet hall was scrambled, replaced by static and distorted audio, whispers, laughter, footsteps. No visual. No readings. Resh, the technician who had first flagged the anomaly, was sweating. The AI still refused to run predictive models, only repeating the phrase appeared like a system glitch. One of the admirals leaned over him and asked what the hell was happening down there. Resh replied without looking up. "I think someone woke up the thing we were warned about." On Earth, in the darkened banquet hall, Commander Vrelk had backed against the wall, sweat beading under his helmet. He tried to issue commands to his guards, but his throat wouldn't cooperate. The man's presence was not just physical, it was psychological. The silence wasn't natural. It was constructed. Something about this man distorted their understanding of reality, of time, of threat. He wasn't cloaked in technology. He wasn't augmented with metal or enhanced with nanotech. He was just a man. And somehow, that made it worse. The air shimmered as more Turvik guards arrived. They encircled him with precision, their weapons synced, their visors glowing red with target locks. They had him surrounded. But he didn't move. One guard gave the signal. Fire. The room exploded in color, bolts, charges, arcs of blue-white light. The sound was deafening. But when the smoke cleared, only one thing had changed. The guards were gone. Not killed. Gone. Their armor lay on the floor in piles like discarded shells steaming. No bodies. No screams. Just silence. The man stood exactly where he had before, the same casual posture, as if waiting for someone to figure it out. One officer dropped to his knees and tried to crawl away. He didn't get far before his legs gave out. Not from injury, but fear. In a distant Turvik research vault, a scientist accessed ancient invasion data flagged under failed Earth incidents. He skimmed a report dated 30 years back, filed under human psychological warfare. It described a mission where a Terran unit had breached a secured facility without triggering a single alarm. No survivors. The report ended with a redacted phrase and the term blackout class operative. The original reader had marked the final line with a note in their own language: do not engage if seen. Do not follow. Do not speak. Do not pursue. The banquet hall's emergency lighting flickered back to life, but by then, most of the officers had either fled or frozen in place. Vrelk tried to compose himself. He drew his ceremonial plasma dagger, not because he thought it would help, but because it gave his shaking hands something to hold. The man finally turned toward him fully, face partially lit, expression unreadable. Vrelk demanded his name. The man tilted his head like the question was absurd. You don't get to ask questions, he replied. You get to remember what you did. The walls trembled. Outside, every streetlight in a 10-mile radius dimmed. Across the city, Turvik patrols reported electrical malfunctions, static interference, strange environmental spikes. One transport ship dropped out of the sky without warning. Another simply shut off mid-flight. But no missiles were launched. No drones were active. There was no tech war being waged. It was as if Earth's remaining systems were waking up, remembering who they were made for. Human-designed, human-controlled, and waiting for one signal. And that signal had arrived. Back in orbit, Fleet Admiral Siruan demanded reinforcements to the surface, but their drop pods refused to launch. Lockdown overrides had failed. Every file associated with Earth operations was being wiped as they watched, overwritten with encrypted codes in an ancient human dialect. Their flagship comms began to broadcast audio that no one had heard in decades, Earth's final broadcast. A human voice, gravelly, calm, and defiant. You thought you ended us. You just made us quiet. In the hall, Vrelk swung the dagger, desperate and furious. The blade missed, cutting only air. The man stepped past him, almost dismissively, and touched the wall. A panel opened. A control unit hidden behind ornamental carvings slid free. He adjusted 2 dials, pulled a worn data core from his pouch, and slotted it in. Then he looked over his shoulder and said, You turned off Earth. I'm turning it back on. As he stepped out of the hall and into the corridor beyond, the building's walls shook harder than before. Distant rumblings filled the air, machines underground roaring awake after decades of silence. Vrelk stood frozen, blade still raised, breathing hard. A message played across every comm unit, every ship, every Turvik helmet. A single phrase, spoken by the man they couldn't name, spoken with finality. I'm not here to reclaim Earth. I'm here to bury what took it. And the signal went dark. He moved through the city like a rumor, leaving nothing behind but silence and systems that no longer obeyed their creators. Everywhere he stepped, technology folded inward, rewrote itself, or simply powered down as if recognizing its original master. The Turvik called it sabotage. Their officers screamed for technicians, for weaponized AI, for something, anything that could neutralize one man. But nothing responded. They didn't realize it wasn't sabotage. It was reactivation. The human systems they thought they'd conquered were never erased, only waiting for a key. And that key had just walked back into their world. A surveillance drone finally caught a full glimpse of him crossing a broken monorail bridge at dawn. The shot zoomed in, grainy but clear. He was injured. A tear in his shoulder. A limp in his step. Yet still he moved with the slow certainty of someone who had walked through worse. The drone's system attempted to identify him. It failed. No name. No rank. No age. The only label the database provided was a corrupted human military tag from decades ago. Blackout. Class 0. The message accompanying it read, "If encountered, you are already too late." Inside a buried command bunker once used by Earth's intelligence agencies, a young rebel technician named Dana watched the feed with wide eyes. She had thought all blackout agents were myths, bedtime stories told by old resistance veterans. Ghost soldiers, emotionless, invisible, unstoppable. But this man didn't look like a myth. He looked tired. He looked real. She tapped into an old satellite dish and began broadcasting again. Only static at first, but then a pulse, a signal the old systems would understand. She had no idea if he'd hear it. But something in her gut said he already had. High above Earth, on the Turvik fleet's flagship, the senior warlords were in chaos. Half the systems were still unresponsive. They couldn't initiate orbital strikes. Communications were filled with human interference patterns. And worst of all, their ground commanders were now refusing to engage unless directly ordered. The last 3 platoons sent after the man never reported back. Their trackers all ended in the same way, flatline. No gunfire. No alarms. Just flatline, like the world around them had swallowed them whole. General Vrelk sat in his quarters, fingers trembling. He had replayed the footage of the banquet over and over again. Not just to understand what happened, but to understand why it had happened to him. He had crushed dozens of species. Earth was supposed to be a primitive, sentimental place. Their warriors were reckless. Their systems disorganized. But this one, he didn't follow any pattern. No monologue. No vengeance speech. Just surgical destruction with a precision that felt ancient. Vrelk opened a restricted file compiled by the Galactic Historical Threat Database, normally locked to Council-level access. He input his override and waited as the screen displayed the classified record. The man had once been called human, but no name was listed. Only a case file from the first Earth incursions marked "Containment failed." The report described a unit of experimental operatives trained to move between systems undetected, built to dismantle empires from within without ever being seen. Every other operative in that project was confirmed dead, except one. The record continued with a final note added 20 years ago by a now-dead Turvik ambassador. "This asset does not pursue power, control, or victory. He erases the conditions that make those concepts possible." Vrelk shut the file and poured himself a drink with a shaking hand. Down on Earth, in a crumbling library long since looted and forgotten, the man moved through the ruined aisles and stopped at a dusty map. He ran a hand across the surface. Beneath the dirt and mold, glowing etchings emerged: pre-war underground tunnels, communication hubs, energy wells built during Earth's last age of preparation. Hidden infrastructure designed not for war, but for legacy. Humans had always known they'd be outgunned. So they designed systems that couldn't be captured, only activated by those born to them. He removed a small cylindrical device from his vest and slid it into a socket behind a torn panel. The walls hummed. Energy surged along the ceiling. The city lights blinked once, then held. For the first time in a generation, the old power grid reconnected, not to the Turvik, but to Earth itself. Back in the rebel hideout, Dana saw the surge and let out a breathless laugh. Screens around her lit up. Terminals once bricked by alien tech started rebooting in old Earth code. Pre-invasion satellites aligned in response to new coordinates. She keyed in a message and broadcasted in every direction. "He's alive! The system sees him. All units, return to fallback positions. Earth is no longer dormant." Somewhere deep underground, a few old soldiers heard the message. Men and women who had been hiding in shadows, waiting for a sign. They loaded weapons buried in oil drums and powered up vehicles wrapped in thermal shielding canvas. One of them looked at the stars and muttered, "Took him long enough." In the upper orbit, a Turvik scout ship picked up the reactivations and tried to interfere. The crew initiated a system wipe. But the ship didn't respond. Instead, it began transmitting old Earth war songs through their own internal speakers, louder and louder, until they had to abandon the craft. It burned up on reentry, not from combat, but from systems that no longer recognized their commands. Vrelk ordered a full counter-invasion. Every active platoon on Earth was instructed to converge on Sector 12, the last known location of the man. But before they could move, the planetary transportation grid locked itself, rerouting all military vehicles into deep containment chambers. Even air traffic shut down. A new override code had entered their systems. And no Turvik officer had the clearance to remove it. Desperate, Vrelk initiated the Omega Protocol, unleashing the elite class of Turvik assassins bred for no other purpose but extermination. Genetically engineered, impossible to bribe, trained in every form of combat known across 9 galaxies. They were called the Wrathborn. And as they landed in the ruins of Sector 12, they formed a circle, weapons primed, scanners wide. One of them finally saw him, standing at the edge of a broken staircase, hand resting on a rusted rail. No weapon. Just a look in his eyes that made the air feel heavier. The lead Wrathborn stepped forward. "You are designated a Class 0 anomaly. Prepare for annihilation." The man said nothing. Then he smiled and asked quietly, "Do your models account for regret?" They didn't. Not until it was far too late. The Wrathborn didn't hesitate. As soon as he spoke, they launched, not with arrogance, but with the kind of calculated brutality that had earned them their title. They moved like blades, silent and synchronized, striking from every angle. Energy weapons, sonic disruptors, molecular blades, all tuned for anti-human warfare. Any other man would have been cut down before he even blinked. But he wasn't any other man. The first assassin lunged high, expecting to break bone with a single swipe. He missed. Not because the man dodged, but because he wasn't there anymore. The Wrathborn registered the movement too late. The human had slipped inside their formation, his motion fluid and unreadable, like his body wasn't bound to the rules of physics they were trained for. One collapsed with a broken throat before he could even register what had happened. Another had his neural interface crushed mid-blink. A third twisted to block a strike only to find his own partner's weapon lodged in his chest, redirected at the last second. The air filled with confused shouts, disrupted tactics, and the unmistakable sound of confidence cracking. He wasn't fighting them. He was teaching them that they didn't know how to fight. One by one, they fell, not to power, but to precision. The last 2 Wrathborn retreated, panting, scanning, recalculating. This wasn't a soldier. This was a living virus in the code of war. They attempted an emergency extraction. The ship hovered just above the ground, ramped down, engines pulsing. The extraction failed. The ship dropped to the ground with a bone-shaking thud. Every system inside fried as soon as it tried to sync with the surface. Earth itself had turned on them. He didn't even look at the ship. He just walked toward the remaining 2. They dropped their weapons and ran. No one chased them. They were already defeated. Far above, in the command vessel, the footage played on every screen. The High Council had joined now. Turvik leadership across sectors watched in silence. This wasn't just about Earth anymore. They were witnessing a myth made real. One counselor, older than the others, leaned forward and whispered, more to himself than anyone else, the phrase that had been buried in their archives, appeared. The man they were watching had no political rank, no state recognition, no power base. He didn't lead an army. He didn't ask for help. But somehow, the moment he arrived, an entire planet had shifted its allegiance without words. Power grids, communications, civilian resistance, ancient defense systems, all bent toward his presence like gravity around a star. Back on Earth, deep in the forgotten infrastructure of the old world, the man accessed a control node buried beneath centuries of dirt and metal. It was never connected to the alien systems. It didn't need to be. It was waiting. He placed his hand on a bioscan pad. The system recognized him immediately. A forgotten voice, synthesized from Earth's last AI program, greeted him with a whisper. "Welcome back." He inserted a core, a glowing blue capsule sealed in his gears since the war began, and the entire facility began to hum. Power surged outward through old world tunnels. Ancient weapons, designed only as deterrents, began warming up. Not to destroy, but to erase access. Earth wasn't about to launch an attack. It was about to make itself permanently unreachable. The signal spread quickly. Turvik outposts found their transporters scrambled. Orbiting ships were pushed to minimum safe distance. Even their strongest encryption began to fail, overridden by the original frequencies that had been written into Earth's foundation. These weren't hack jobs or brute force attacks. These were keys fitting perfectly into long-forgotten locks. The humans hadn't lost the war. They had simply delayed it, betting everything on the appearance of a man who could finish it in silence. In a rebel stronghold, Dana watched the systems align. More survivors were joining by the minute. They weren't just soldiers. Civilians, scientists, engineers. People who had once believed their world was gone, now typing, linking, relaying. Not because he asked them. Because he didn't need to. They knew what to do. They had just been waiting for the sign that Earth was still alive. And now, it was screaming through every frequency, "We remember." Above, Vrelk stood in his chamber alone, watching the window. The sky was changing. A faint shimmer across the atmosphere signaled the rise of an ancient planetary shield. The last one of its kind. A system so powerful it had never been used. Not because Earth couldn't. Because it wouldn't. Until now. He turned away and activated his private escape command. A pod launched silently from the ship's underbelly. He had no intention of going down with the others. Let the High Council pretend they still had a plan. Let them write reports and argue. He was getting off this world. But his pod didn't make it far. The moment it passed through the lower orbit, its guidance system shut down. A small blinking light appeared on the pod's screen. Just 4 words. One last transmission before blackout. You don't get away. The man stepped out of the ruins and looked toward the eastern horizon. A satellite repositioned itself in sync with his gaze. One by one, the pieces of Earth's original defense network aligned. Not to attack, but to disconnect. Earth was not rejoining the galactic web. It was leaving it. Completely. Forever. No ships in. No data out. A global firewall rising across layers of sky. The planet wasn't just going dark. It was going invisible. In the final hours before full isolation, every Turvik system was given one last update. A simple message that played across every screen in cold human text. Not a threat. Not a warning. Just a reminder. You didn't win. You were permitted to believe you did. That permission has now expired. And with that, the feeds died. Systems locked. Earth's orbit emptied. The man stood in silence and closed his eyes. For the first time since the war began, he let his body relax. Somewhere deep beneath his feet, the core systems of a wounded planet had finally stabilized. Above, the stars pulsed with distant wars and greed. But Earth was no longer part of them. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply disappeared into the morning fog. No medals. No banners. No applause. Just the legacy of one appearance, and a galaxy that would never forget what it meant. The quiet that followed was not the kind born of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness left in the wake of something undeniable. Across the galaxy, signals once beaming from Earth ceased entirely. Ships traveling nearby found no response. Earth's coordinates no longer returned pings. Star maps adjusted in real time, marking the world as a dead zone. To those watching from afar, it was as though the planet had finally died, taking its secrets with it. But those who knew better understood it hadn't died at all. It had simply shut its doors. Inside the abandoned Turvik capital on Earth, only rubble and burnt circuits remained. The once proud spires of conquest banners now lay crumpled in ash. A few alien survivors wandered in disbelief, speaking in hushed tones, haunted by what they'd seen and what they hadn't understood. There was no parade. No army. No uprising. One man had walked through their empire and rendered it silent. Not with violence alone, but with memory. The systems they used were not theirs. The foundation they stood on had never truly belonged to them. It had always known who to answer to. And now it had decided. The High Council of Turvik convened a week later in emergency session, buried deep within a war moon on the edge of contested space. No one raised their voice. Reports sat untouched. For the first time in decades, the fear was real, not manufactured for military propaganda. One member stood and asked the question that no one wanted to hear out loud. If he could do that to Earth, what stops him from appearing on other worlds? What stops him from undoing everything? The answer was already waiting in their systems. A file had somehow entered their secure archive without passing through firewalls, timestamps, or protocols. No signature. Just a set of coordinates. Not a threat. An invitation. It led to a planet destroyed long ago, one marked uninhabitable by their own fleet. A place they had glassed as an example. But new satellite images showed green forests, active weather systems, and faint power signatures. The man hadn't just reawakened Earth. He had restored what they had taken. And if he could bring a world back from nothing, they realized, he could take one there just as easily. Back on Earth, far from the fallen towers and broken weapons, children played in the dirt near old bunkers now growing flowers. They didn't know the details of what had happened. All they knew was that the skies were quiet now, the fear had gone, and the grown-ups were no longer whispering at night. A girl stood near the edge of a hill, watching a bird circle overhead. Beside her sat a man in worn boots, quiet as ever, eyes following the horizon. She didn't know his name. He hadn't told anyone. But she asked anyway. "Are you staying?" He didn't answer right away. Just watched the wind move through the grass like an old memory brushing past. Finally, he said, "Not always. But long enough to make sure it sticks." She smiled and skipped back toward the others. The network that had reconnected Earth's old systems now pulsed with new life. The few human engineers still alive discovered things even they hadn't built, subsystems buried under layers of history, routines that activated only once the planet had fully isolated. These weren't weapons. They were tools. For rebuilding. For growth. Earth hadn't prepared to fight forever. It had prepared to survive long enough for the right moment. And now that moment had passed. The future no longer belonged to conquest or resistance. It belonged to those who remembered what it meant to exist without needing to prove it. He spent his days moving quietly through the rebuilt fragments, repairing what mattered, ignoring what didn't. He didn't take command. Didn't give orders. He just showed up where things were broken and left once they worked again. People tried to follow him, to ask questions, to understand. But he didn't offer stories or explain motives. Every answer was in the silence he left behind. One morning, as mist settled over the valley where the first new colony had been planted, a transport ship drifted low above the treetops. Not Turvik. Human design. Ancient and rusted, barely functional. Inside were 10 survivors from a lost crew, thought dead for years. He was there to greet them when they landed. No welcome party. No celebration. Just him, helping lower the ramp as if he'd been waiting for them all this time. One of the survivors stepped forward and stared. "You were in the stories." He nodded once. We didn't think they were true. He handed her a canteen and replied, some stories aren't meant to be believed. Just remembered. They settled in quietly. No questions asked? They already knew better. Somewhere beyond the stars, rumors began to spread. Not of war, but of silence. Traders whispered of a planet that no longer answered. Of ships that veered off course when they tried to approach. Of systems that froze without explanation. And always, in the middle of these stories, was a single figure. No name. No rank. Just the one who appeared. Galactic powers began rewriting their protocol. New war plans were drafted with Earth marked as null space. No-fly zones were extended. Recruitment posters for new soldiers excluded references to Earth's conquest. It was as if the galaxy itself was trying to forget what had happened. But it never quite worked. Somewhere, somehow, the story always resurfaced. A man who arrived after the war was won. Who didn't reclaim territory or plant a flag. Who didn't shout or rally crowds. Who didn't need an army to change everything. He just appeared. And when he did, the war ended. Not because he demanded it. But because nothing could continue in his presence. Not lies. Not tyranny. Not delusion. The systems rejected it. Reality rebalanced itself. And so the galaxy moved on, pretending Earth was a mistake, a glitch, a forgotten ruin. While down on that silent, reborn world, a man walked through the morning fog, carrying tools, not weapons, watching over a people who no longer needed protection. He was not the hero they waited for. He was the consequence they ignored. And now that he had appeared, they understood one final truth, carried not in words, but in the silence he left behind. Some wars are not won with fire. Some are ended with memory.